Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Bob the Booker and today I'm doing a wrap-up of all the books I read during April. It's been a bit of a weird month for me. I found that I've definitely been fine with kind of lots of audiobooks and that's kind of mostly gotten me through the month. But I found it a bit harder to focus on physical books. I'm not entirely sure why this month. I think maybe things have just been a bit busier. But the things I have read, I have really strongly enjoyed. Apparently I read about 21 books this month. Again, how did this happen? Who knows? I think thanks largely to audiobooks really there. A few of these books as well are quite short. But this also had the kind of really nice, very satisfying effect of taking me to exactly 100 books this year so far, which again is kind of a bit bonkers. With the 100th book being the last one from this. And it's weird, I finished the book this morning, speaking now in May, and part of me kind of was thinking last night, like, oh, I could really finish this book, you know, get it really sort of done in the last bit of April and get it. I was just too tired and I wouldn't have taken it all in properly. And part of me did like the satisfaction of ending on an exact 100. It's just very, very satisfying. Anyway, I will stop saying the word satisfying and I will get on with talking about these books. So a few of these I'm going to sort of group together because I've covered them either in other videos or they're kind of sort of similar, well, there's a bit of a crossover. So the first four I want to mention were all ones that I mentioned during the 2004 Booker Prize shortlist deep dive video. That was a lot of words. So that was Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell, I'll Go to Bed at Noon by Gerard Woodward, The Master by Colm toibin, and Bitter Fruit by Achmat Dangor. All of which I really enjoyed in various ways, and for sort of more detailed thoughts go to my 2004 video on that. But I thought it was really interesting. It's quite fun looking back over old Booker shortlists, and it's lucky that I do find that enjoyable because I'm doing quite a lot of them. But no, it is kind of good to kind of go back and have a little bit more of a deep look. So kind of going in reverse order here with those. Bitter Fruit by Achmat Dangor is this sort of very it's sort of set against a very violent backdrop within South Africa, lots of sort of physical and sexual violence and emotional violence. It's really grim in a lot of ways as a book, but is so interesting. And it's amazing how the writer manages to keep such a tense kind of writing style throughout. It's so taut, it's kind of unsparing, but with these really nice little tender moments. There's The Master by Colm toibin, which I didn't enjoy as much as some of Colm toibin's other works that I've read, but I still thought The Master, which is all about Henry James and his life, was so touchingly done. It's very much written in a Henry James style, which I think is actually partly why I didn't necessarily warm to it, because Henry James is an author who, although, you know, from what I've read of his, I think The Spores of Poynton, Portrait of a Lady, I've really enjoyed the work itself. Part of me finds his writing style a little bit difficult at times, and Colm toibin follows that and doesn't always necessarily work for me, but at the same time I thought there were so many beautiful moments in it. It covers a lot around Henry James and his sexuality, his sort of dealings with kind of being an American in the UK, his kind of own imposter syndrome is not really the word. It's kind of his own sort of sense of failure and success. You know, the book begins with the failure of his play that left him so sort of embarrassed and ashamed. And, you know, he's a writer and then he writes this play and it fails. And, you know, that hit him particularly hard. And I think toibin does some really gorgeous things with language there in terms of really capturing some of those feelings. There's I'll Go to Bed at Noon by Gerard Woodward, which I rave about a lot in the 2004 video. I think is just sublime. I am so glad that going through Booker shortlists has led me to this book. This is a book all about a family kind of in free fall. It's the second of a trilogy, but actually I think it stands really well alone. And well, I read it alone and I loved it. So it's this family sort of roughly around sort of North London, and there are loads of problems of sort of alcoholism, and we kind of get this idea of sort of generational trauma. You know, there's a father figure who we never meet in this book, at least, who is sort of was really quite violent and emotionally neglectful and horrible, and we see the impact on kind of the next sort of couple of generations. Like there's a you know, there's one of the men, Janice Bryan in the book is just so almost emotionally stunted in some ways, and is really having a terrible time sort of battling alcoholism. There is sort of some sort of substance abuse from Colette, who's the sort of the sort of mother of kind of one of the other characters, who is also has problems with alcohol. And it's so interesting to watch how this family just sort of implodes, and there are these moments where it looks like everything's getting back in order and then it falls apart again, and there's something so beautiful about how that is done. I found it so riveting, and it's so subtly done at times and so tenderly and sensitively done. I thought this was an absolute masterpiece, and I was completely sold on it. Yeah, I mean, and it's about 400 and something pages, I think, and I sort of, for the whole time, was like, I want more of this book. And luckily there are. There's a prequel and a sequel. So, you know, in this trilogy, so I really do want to go and check those out. But that's, again, one of those, I mean, I don't know, is Gerard Woodward an author that everyone else has heard of? And I just hadn't. But I kind of get the feeling that, you know, that it's really interesting going back over some old Booker shortlists, because there are authors who maybe appear on the shortlist or long list once, sort of 10, 20 years ago, and don't appear again. But it's kind of amazing, because they are often authors who, you know, have gone on to kind of still create loads of incredible work, but it's just that they're not as sort of big household names, I guess, as someone like Hilary Mantel or Coetzee or McEwan or whoever else. And so it's so interesting to me, because they kind of slip under the radar there. And for me, Gerard Woodward, based on that, you know, based on I'll Go to Bed at Noon, I want to really go and read a lot more of. So yeah, super interesting when that happens. A few of these are going to be sort of, I've spoken about this before, but the next book was Klara and the Sun, which I've got a copy of just down here. There we go. Should have prepared this before the video. Klara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro. That was just on the floor. There's like a little pile down there. That's there's not like a really tiny bookshelf down there. And yeah, so Klara and the Sun, I did a separate video on, and I just think was gorgeous. I totally see why, for many people, it doesn't live up perhaps to some of their other, you know, other books by Ishiguro, like Remains of the Day or Never Let Me Go, which I adored both of those. And When We Were Orphans, I think, is also a sort of an overlooked one from him. But Klara and the Sun, I thought, was really touching and really beautiful in so many ways. So it's all about this artificial friend, this AF, who's basically sort of like a robot designed to sort of be a companion to particularly young people, and you know, it's paired with this young girl, well, sort of teenage girl, who has some kind of terminal illness, or, you know, is kind of chronically ill in some way. And what's just so beautiful about it for me is how Ishiguro blends these ideas of kind of what it means to be human, you know, things like souls and spirituality, and how that links up here with a kind of robot figure, right? So the fact that Klara is you know, the titular Klara is so convinced that she can save this young girl's life by praying to the sun, because she's powered by the sun to some degree. You know, she's sort of vaguely solar powered, and so she thinks the same could happen, you know, to look after the young girl. And it's harrowing, well, not harrowing, maybe it's not the right word, but it's really sad and really touching, how it does that. I think, yeah, some people's criticisms of this book, I think, are fair, in the sense that it perhaps doesn't explore some of these ideas in quite the same way as you know, other sort of, for example, like science fiction often does, and science fiction often goes in a lot further. Never Let Me Go in some ways went in a bit further, but I just think this is such a touching and heartwarming tale, and it's one of those books that, as well, partly because I was trying to read this without thinking of the Booker, or without trying to think of other books by Ishiguro, but part of me, it was actually really fun for me. I just loved letting the story wash over me and just have fun with this book, because it's so gorgeous and so pretty in so many ways. And it's, yeah, I just thought it was really touching and really lovely. The next few that I read this month were a really quite a broad mix, because a lot of these were audiobooks, and and sort of other things that I had as advanced copies and what have you. So it just ended up with this really interesting and kind of fun mix. So the first was the Angel Catbird Omnibus by Margaret Atwood. So this is sort of three comic book series that, or three comic books that Margaret Atwood wrote, and somebody else, I can't remember their exact names, it will be on the cover of the book, did the artwork for her. So something I didn't know, Margaret Atwood used to do quite a lot of her own sort of drawing and designs for either characters or kind of comics or things like that, which I actually can totally see making sense, but it was quite an interesting addition to kind of learn that about Margaret Atwood, who I love anyway. And yeah, I mean, Angel Catbird is, I mean, it's stupid in so many ways, but I kind of enjoyed that ride. So the whole idea is that there are these, the kind of main kind of person is this sort of half half cat, half bird figure, and sort of half human. And so there's all of these kinds of characters who are kind of half cats, you know, sort of people by day, cats by night kind of thing, and a few other people who are birds by day, you know, all of those, some kind of variation. And this one person is a sort of, you know, Angel Catbird is sort of, he's both bird and cat, so he can fly and be a cat, and then is also human at various other times. And it's, I mean, it explores very, like, very traditional, I'd say, kind of comic book tropes, in the sense of, you know, like, plot to destroy the world by this one man with an evil potion kind of thing. But I kind of think, as sort of cliched and as whatever as it feels at times, I just really enjoyed the way that Margaret Atwood kind of goes for it. It's so, you know, we know from her other writing she's not afraid to get dark and to get, you know, go into some really difficult territory. And what I really enjoy about Angel Catbird is it's just so goofy, it's so silly. There are all these little quotes at the bottom of the page from various kind of animal protection charities as well, talking about, you know, how to make sure we protect local wildlife. And that's alongside, you know, like, and it'll be related to the bit of text. So if there's something about, you know, cats killing wild birds, it'll talk about, you know, keeping your cat indoors and all that kind of stuff. It's really quite cute. And I don't know, I wonder if maybe, you know, after a bit more time I'll have different thoughts on it, but I just thought it was so charming because it's so goofy. It's Margaret Atwood having fun, and I mean, she's quite a fun writer anyway, you know, you can tell she's having fun with her craft. But I think it's so interesting to read, I don't know, something like Handmaid's Tale or Dearly or Blind Assassin, and then read Angel Catbird, which is just, yeah, I like to see this kind of writer having fun. It's not like the highest quality literature you're going to get, you know, ever, but not everything has to be that. It's kind of fun to just, yeah, have a bit more fun with it. So there we go. Next is a book I really enjoyed and did not expect to like as much as I did, which is The Listeners by Jordan Tannahill. So I mentioned this a little bit in my book of predictions video, but essentially the idea of this book is that there is this woman who can hear a low humming sound, and nobody else around her at first seems to be able to hear it. And you know, at first she's sort of able to put it off, but it really starts invading her life. She can't sleep, and then because she can't sleep, she gets a little bit more erratic and unwell and stressed and everything, and it really starts having an impact on her marriage and her relationship with her daughter. And then she finds other people who can also hear this, and it's such an interesting exploration for me of those ideas around what it's like to kind of be in a cult, or the kind of whole like fake news-y kind of sort of thing that we're in, well, that people that's kind of been purported and reported a lot recently. So, you know, these people kind of are almost a cult, kind of all this little group kind of protecting each other, and there is a real sense of like the outside world versus them, where they want to look after themselves, but they're also convinced, sometimes they're convinced that they're going crazy, sometimes they're convinced that the world is going crazy, sometimes they're convinced that there's a plot against them. And it's really interesting because you see how everybody else around these characters is slowly stepping back from them, and it's so interesting because I think to dive into that is quite difficult territory. And for me, Jordan Tannahill, who I hadn't actually heard of before, but I really want to check out more of, just goes for it. And it's so interesting because there are these sort of subtle moments, particularly towards the end, where when characters are kind of either turning on each other or looking the other way a little bit. It's so subtly done. Where the character, the main character, because we're being told it through her perspective, almost becomes quite unreliable because she is so convinced in her own little world, about everything that's going on, and that if someone disagrees with her, it's because of some kind of conspiracy. And actually, that makes her both really unreliable, but is also a really interesting perspective into what it can look like for somebody who's in that. We all have our own things in our lives where we are very, very convinced of something, and for some people that does align with science, for some people it doesn't. But you can kind of see how actually that colours so much of how you see the world, right? And I think this is just so, so well done. And I was just such a fan of this. I thought it was gorgeous. And a really, really easy read in some ways as well. It really flies by, but whilst kind of packing a bit of a punch. So yeah, I really, really enjoyed this. Next, I read a Booker Prize winner, The Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie, which, is quite well known, won the Booker of the Booker. I have to admit that, maybe it's, I think, I'm trying to think of a nice way of phrasing this. So, I really like the Rushdie books I've read, but for some reason, something isn't connecting enough for me to, completely adore them. So, I've read Shame, Midnight's Children now, and Quichotte. And I enjoyed all of them. I thought all of them were brilliantly done. But sometimes there's almost like a snarky element in the books that throws me off. I'm not sure if I don't know. But Midnight's Children, I thought, had so much that was gorgeous about it. So it's this idea of, it's kind of a really interesting magical realist, post-colonial sort of idea of the birth of India as a modern state. So it talks about the eve, the night when India becomes independent. In 1947, I want to say, and there, the kind of idea of it being very auspicious to be born as that was coming in. And so you've got these sort of 140 odd children, I want to say, maybe more, who were all born within that first hour of India's independence. And they kind of are, they all have basically superpowers. And for me, what was just so beautiful about that is just how well that's explored, that in some ways shouldn't work. There's kind of, but what is really interesting about it for me is this kind of, the harsh political landscape of, post-colonialism, of talking about empire, and then kind of later in the book when we get, I want to say, Indira Gandhi's kind of quite harsh policies. And what's really amazing for me about this is how Rushdie is able to combine those very harsh physical realities with this really kind of fantastical tale. And part of me as I was reading this was kind of like, I had that kind of moment I often get with Curtsy, where I'm like, oh, you clever, where it suddenly dawns on me what they're actually doing. And for me, it's just this idea that actually, as India kind of regained independence, or the birth of modern India in 1947, at this moment, when nations are born, or any kind of thing to do with nations have their own narrative and their own stories that they tell to kind of dictate, to talk about who they are, right? Every country does it to some degree, whether it's an historical moment, whether it's a sort of a series of historical moments, whether it's, a founding tale or something like that. Thinking of the UK, things like St. George, even though I'm not actually really sure how British he is, but that whole kind of thing of these kind of characters who are sort of meant to be very mythical and kind of a part of the fabric of that country existing. And I think what Rushdie does here that's really clever is take that idea and kind of blow it up even further. So not only is it a story, the more I'm talking about this, the more I'm convincing myself that I liked this a lot, and I did like it a lot, but I'm now wondering whether I move it from a 4 to a 5 stars based on this. Exploring this idea of a nation story, but the nation story being a really fantastical one made of these characters with superhero powers. And so, for example, some of the characters, the character we sort of see the most, he can enter people's thoughts, and so he's able to connect all of the Midnight's children together. And then you've got these other characters who sort of have, the closer to midnight, the more powerful. So the ones sort of closer to 1 a.m. Have sort of weaker powers, sometimes that feel a bit more redundant, but. One character, for example, can travel through mirrors, which is really quite cool, actually. And I think what's really clever, and I see why this book is so beloved. I think also I do wonder if some of my enjoyment of it was hindered by the fact I was listening to it as an audiobook. I literally have it there somewhere on my shelf, but part of me was like, oh, it's a bit long. I might just, while this audiobook's here, I'm just going to listen to it. So I may go back and reread it. Definitely see why people love it. I think occasionally I just sort of wanted bits of the story to just kind of get there a little bit faster, maybe. I don't know if that's unfair. And again, I think that is also an audiobook thing, right? Because audiobooks are probably, depending on your reading speed, but for me at least, audiobooks are slower than it would be if I were reading it. So sometimes something that's maybe 40 pages might be, a couple of hours or something. Whereas you might have kind of gotten through that quite quickly. So yeah, but either way, I mean, a gorgeous, gorgeous book. I see why it won the Booker and why it has so much love around it. I'm not sure if I'm fully ready to kind of commit to being a massive Rushdie fan, but from the 3 books of his I read so far, there's a lot that I've really enjoyed about them. And I think Midnight's Children is so clever in what it does in kind of blending the idea of a national myth and a national tale with harsh realities and really magical things. So yeah, really interesting and really well done. Next, a couple of non-fiction books. So Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. So this got a lot of love, and I think it was kind of did really well in the BookTube Prize, I want to say, as well. Something like that. But yes, so this book is non-fiction, all about the idea of the caste system in India. So actually it was quite interesting listening to this kind of around the same time as Midnight's Children, and the idea of caste, so the Indian caste system, and how elements of that can also be seen in, for example, in other countries, particularly I think Isabel Wilkerson focuses on the US. And there's this interesting idea of, I want to say it's Dalits, who are the lowest caste in India, and how at one point she is in India, Isabel Wilkerson, a black woman, is in India at one point for a conference, I think it was, and kind of sees this, is introduced to some students and is sort of introduced to the class as, like, oh, she's African American, which is the sort of the Dalits of the US. And it's so interesting because she then also explores how when Indian people from different Indian castes meet, for example, in other countries, and she talks about the US, there is still some of that hierarchy there. And I just think it's such a brilliant book because she weaves together a lot of really interesting personal narratives about her own experiences of racism. So, for example, traveling on a plane and being the one that people kind of target for security purposes. They're a bit skeptical of her because she doesn't have a bag, for example. But that's because she's literally just sort of doing a local flight, or not going particularly far for a conference or something like that. And just so many kind of narratives that you can just see how it really wears her down on a sort of daily basis, and all those sort of cumulative microaggressions and macroaggressions, I guess, is the other one for that, or just aggressions. How all of these kind of things combine to just kind of wear her down and make it much more difficult for her to just go through life and kind of just get the best out of each day. So sometimes she's just so tired from having to explain things or having to resist assumptions in some ways. And yeah, I thought it was a really interesting thing to map that against the Indian caste system, because she talks a little bit, for example, about at least I think it was in this book, I'm fairly sure it was, it talks about, for example, early in the US, where there were kind of all these discussions around, for example, no Jews or no Italians, and there was this moment where Italians became white and so did Irish people became white in in the US. So for a period, you know, white was only basically Scandinavian or people from, you know, kind of Anglo kind of countries, and so British settlers in the US were seen as white, but their Irish counterparts were not. And so it's interesting how kind of over time those shifted to kind of being seen as white, but kind of against a backdrop of other people very much not being seen as white, and particularly in terms of the kind of privileges that that confers upon someone. So that actually in US history, you know, once Italians, for example, were seen as being white. I don't know why I did quotes over Italians instead of white, which is the wrong way around. So when Italians were then sort of seen as white, they were then kind of seen as, you know, they were then given some of the privileges that that other people were given, but that was kind of in a way to also keep out other people. So yeah, really, really well done. It's quite long, but I think really, really worth that length. I just thought it was gorgeous, and really, really powerful. Yeah, and next another non-fiction book I read, which is Letters to My Weird Sisters by Joanne Limburg. So this is all, I got this as an advance copy, so this is Joanne Limburg kind of talking sort of personally about her experiences of being an autistic woman, and an autistic Jewish woman, and she talks about, she basically writes letters to various women in history who she thinks were, who she feels some kind of affinity with. And I mean, she's very careful to say that she's not kind of diagnosing them as being autistic or what have you, but she kind of sees traits in them that she thinks may be kind of seen as somewhat autistic or kind of on the spectrum. So it's really interesting because she kind of delves into, you know, various women in history who are not particularly well known, and then also Virginia Woolf, who's obviously a bit better known. And it's really interesting because she kind of goes into these ideas of these kind of, as she calls them, like weird sisters, and, you know, how difficult it must have been for them to be their true selves and to kind of articulate their thoughts and their needs in a time that was not very well set up for them. And she draws parallels with herself for it. It didn't always feel that successful to me. I think some of them, I don't know what, yeah, some of them I just couldn't necessarily connect to that much, but maybe that's also me, you know, reading that, sort of not belonging to the groups of these weird sisters. So I still think it's really worth checking out. I thought it was really interesting. And definitely like something completely unexpected, like a kind of book that I don't think I've read anything like this before. And I just thought it was so interesting just how she kind of ties together, for example, these women in history with her own personal experiences, and then with, for example, UK and US law and policy around some of these things. So she quotes a book that I really loved, and I think I spoke about in my last roundup, called Austerity. All about austerity, which called Crippled, sorry, which is all about austerity in the UK especially, and how it really harmed disabled people. And she quotes that a lot and brings up the fact that actually some of the conditions for women 400 years ago haven't necessarily changed, particularly when it comes to mental illness, or when it comes to autism, or when it comes to anti-Semitism, and various other things. So yeah, very, very interesting. A few other things I have read. I'm taking a lot of time on each of these books, apologies. So next, The Hour of the Star by Clarice Lispector. Now, a friend of mine read this ages ago and told me that I would love it. And I requested it from my library, and then obviously libraries were shut for a long time, so I only recently got it. And I still don't really know what I think about this book, but I loved it. I don't really know what happens. So it's kind of this really interesting narrative, and it's really great reading the translator notes, because I think I want to say she was Brazilian, Clarice Lispector. And it's really interesting reading the translator notes, because they sort of say, yeah, you know what, look, even in the native language, this grammar does not make sense and is a bit, you know, it's really unusual word choices or word patterns. And I think that's what I really enjoyed about it. I still can't necessarily work out what happened, but it does involve sort of several characters talking about well, there's kind of one character talking about various people he sort of had interactions with, and these women he's known, but and it's about 80 pages long. I mean, it's really short, but for me, it's just such an interesting wild ride. I don't think I've ever read anything like this before. I kind of want to reread it and get a proper sense of my thoughts on it, but I loved the discomfort of it, if that makes sense. I loved not really knowing what was happening. Because I think this book is not necessarily about that. It's not necessarily plot driven in that sense. It's kind of quite winding and meandering, but in a really powerful way, because it's just you're just there for the journey. And I think that was really well done. So yeah, I'd say that. And next was No One Belongs Here More Than You by Miranda July, which is a collection of short stories. She's got such a... I hadn't read anything before by her, but it was recommended as part of a reading list for a writing club I was part of. And I just thought these were really quite charming. Miranda July just has a really interesting point of view. These short stories are kind of... not all of them were successful for me, but they're quite bizarre, and she has a really great sense of wit. So they're, you know, really great observations about everyday life, really silly things happening. Sometimes things happen in the story that are so sort of fantastical and weird that it kind of comes out of nowhere. Sometimes it's far more kind of grounded in reality, but I just thought it was really well done and really interesting. So those were the first half. I've decided to split this video in two again, because despite me thinking that this would be a short one, I rambled and really went on about some of these books. So I've split this into two parts. That was part one, and please look out for part two coming shortly.